This is what they call the Belfast room. And here's where the ship actually launched. And over there on that far side, you actually have a launch day ticket. Now walking in, we're going to Southampton. One of the things that you do see on these placards is the date and the article number. So these items were brought up in 1994, and that's the category number. So a couple other things were brought up in 87. Now, from a couple tours that we've taken over here, this porthole frame was one of the first things that was ever brought up. It was in 1987.
So instead, they used these tender ships to ferry the passengers up into Titanic, also to Olympic as well. So in Cherbourg, France, they had two of them. One was this called the Traffic, and that was for the third class. And then we had the Nomadic here for the first and second class. And this ship was the very ship that Margaret Brown, also known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, although always Margaret when she was alive, took. So did John Jacob Astor and his new wife Madeline Astor. They all boarded the Nomadic to get ferried up to the Titanic. This is the very last remaining White Star Line ship in the world. For the longest time it was being used as a restaurant on the Seine in Paris, but back in 2006 it went back home to Belfast, and it's now been restored to the way she looked in 1912, and it's right at the Titanic Museum. So you can board that ship and walk in their footsteps. Another thing to do. Now, after Titanic sank, of course, the White Star Line started to go down in a way as well. It was eventually bought out by the Cunard Line, its competitor, who the British government had a stake in that company. They would make all of their military ships. And then after other mergers and so on and so forth, the White Star Line is now technically part of the Carnival Cruise Line. Yes, so though they had a lot of entertainment, they have a lot of entertainment on those ships. Titanic had no entertainment on those ships, so it's very, very different. But they own the trademark of the White Star Line flag. So after she left Cherbourg, which just took a few hours to get after she set sail from Southampton, it took about another day. The next morning on April 11th, they pulled into Queenstown, Ireland to pick up the last of the passengers, also let some of the passengers leave as well. Lucky for them. So we're gonna board right this way. Right here is the Marconi wireless office. Would have been up on the boat deck, the highest deck on the ship, so that all of the antennas would be coming out of this room. And then between the two big masts out on the top of the ship, there would be the antennas that came in between them. On a clear day, they could get signals up to 1,000 miles away. Which was very helpful. This was very new technology for the time. It was just starting to be on ships within the last few years. Imagine no communication on ships before that. It's a little scary. But Marconi the Marconi machine was invented by a gentleman named Guglielmo Marconi, and this was his company's technology. All of their stuff, all of their materials. So they would subcontract onto all of the ships. So the White Star Line did not own this room. It was the Marconi. And the two gentlemen that worked here, one named Jack Phillips, who turned 25 on April 11th, and also Harold Bride, who was 22 years old. They were employees of the Marconi company, and their job was to send and receive all of the messages on the ship. The first class passengers, they had the option of purchasing Marconi messages. So this was also new and novelty for them. They liked being able to send out a message from the middle of the ocean, and it was $3 for the first 10 words and a few cents for every word after that. So imagine one text message could cost about $85 in today's money. Very expensive. And they sure kept these guys very busy as well. So though they were sending and receiving messages having to do with the ship and other ships in the area, they were also sending out messages on behalf of the passengers. Now those ice warnings started as early as Friday, just about 2.5 days before the iceberg collision. And they were getting messages from different ships saying ice fields were further south than normal. And on that Saturday, Captain Smith did turn south 10 miles and then headed west. And he had 43 years of experience behind him, and this was unusual conditions that these icebergs were further south more than normal because they had had an unseasonably warm winter a few months earlier. So he did try to avoid those ice fields. Now that Saturday night though, the battery of the Marconi machine, it stopped working. The circuit blew, and the two guys in here were told, do not touch the equipment. If anything happens, you wait till you get to port. Well, imagine, okay, your cell phone's dead. We know what that's like. So they're like, no, we're going to fix it, because they also got paid per message they sent and received. So they still had several days of being on the ship without getting paid. So they worked all night that Saturday night into Sunday morning. Messages were getting backed up that were being sent from whether it was from the bridge or from the passengers, or all of the incoming messages that they had to then transcribe. So on that Sunday, they received 8 iceberg warnings from several different ships within a 700 square mile area. The Olympic was the furthest out, about 700 miles. The closest though was called the Californian. It was only 19 miles away, and if their top speed was 19 knots, they could have gotten there in about an hour. They were that close in proximity. And so there was a gentleman on that ship named Cyril Evans. He was the Marconi operator there, and he sent out a message to Jack, who was on the machine. He was the senior operator, and these two guys, they were more than qualified for their job. They knew what they were doing. But Cyril sends out a message to Jack saying, hey, old man, which was slang back then for, hey, what's up, basically. But Jack was so busy trying to keep up with everything that they were backed up with, he didn't really find that amusing. And Cyril had said that there's ice fields everywhere, we're shutting down, we suggest that you do the same. But Jack writes back, keep out, I'm busy working Cape Race. So whether it was just the fact that Cyril didn't like that reply, or his 17-hour shift for the day was over, and there was no law that said that the radio had to be on 24/7 until after Titanic sank, Cyril turned off his radio and went to bed, and literally 5 minutes later at 11:40 that night, Titanic collided with the iceberg. So the closest ship did not hear those radio calls. Once the collision occurred, they got the message to start sending out the CQD, come quick distress, MGY. MGY was Titanic's call letters. And then Harold says to Jack, hey, why don't you try SOS? That's the new call sign. Maybe this will be the only time we get to use it. So there were several ships that were responding, but they were in those ice fields just as much as Titanic was. And the one that responded that was on their way was the Carpathia, and she was 44 miles away, and it would take her about 4 hours to get there. And Titanic sank in 2 hours 40 minutes. Didn't make it in time. But the captain on that ship, Captain Henry Rostron, said, we're going. So that was the closest possibility of hope. But these guys kept on working. Jack kept on tapping out those messages till the very, very, very last moment. And the last message that was sent out from Titanic was, come quick, engine room full, and the power went out. So those were her last words, come quick, engine room full. The two guys, they made a run for it. Harold made it onto an upturned collapsible. His legs and feet were frozen from being in the water. Then when he got brought up to the Carpathia, he had bandages all over his legs and his feet, and he was carried into the Marconi office on that ship so that he could start sending out the names of the passengers that survived. He said of his friend Jack, he had never seen anybody so determined, so focused with their job, with their work. He was bound and determined to help everybody, save everybody. Jack gave away his life vest to somebody else, and he did not survive. So Jack Phillips is my Jack on Titanic. a hero, definitely. So Jack Phillips, Harold Bride, heroes, impeccable. Now in this room we have lots of pieces from what we call life on board the ship. We have a purser's envelope, a key, pocket watches. We have some cookware, pots and pans from the kitchens, also some flooring. Titanic had a lot of firsts for her day. Not only was she the largest ship ever built, and also what Thomas Andrews said, she is the most perfect ship that a human brain could put together. But she had some very firsts, such as the first time a ship would have running hot water. So Mr. Ismay, he would, being the president of the company, he would travel on all of the maiden voyages of his ships, and he had traveled on Olympic's maiden voyage and thought of different niceties that he could add to Titanic, including running hot water. So it was the first time that the passengers would see those. Some of the first class passengers had their own bathrooms with their own marble bathtubs and were very excited about hot water. They didn't have to boil it. Very cool. Also, it was the first time they would have their own electric heaters on the ship so that they could change the temperature in their cabins. And it was also the first ship to have private promenade decks outside of their cabins, which is very normal for now. So right here in the center we have one of those faucets, hot and cold, next to some flooring from the kitchens and the galleys. We have some postcards. Now I mentioned how fabric and paper probably wouldn't survive under the water unless it was encased in leather. So the tannic acid that's used in the tanning process is preventing any of the bacteria and microorganisms that are down in the ocean floor from getting inside and eating away at whatever is in there. So a great example back here, we have, in this case, we have a piece of sheet music, some wool socks, a silk scarf, and some clarinet reeds, which are made out of cane wood. And the clarinet reeds and the sheet music, as well as the postcards in that little case back there next to the bench, they were owned by a man named Howard Irwin. He was a clarinet player. We also have his clarinet in our collection too. Our collection has over 5,500 pieces, whether it's between here, our museum in Las Vegas. Also, we have the traveling exhibition that goes throughout the world, and the vault, and things that we haven't even been able to put on display yet. So there's lots to see. And there's so much still down there as well. But now, Howard, let me tell you a little story about Howard. So he was traveling with his friend Henry Soutall, and they were going back home to Denver, having traveled the world playing music. And the night before they set sail on Titanic, they were at a pub in Southampton having a little too much to drink. And Henry says to Howard, "I'm going to go and I'll see you tomorrow on the ship." So Howard says, "I'm going to stay, but here, take my stuff with you." So says goodbye to Henry and all of his things. Howard continues to drink some more and gets into a little bar fight, gets knocked out, wakes up the next morning on the deck of a ship that has shanghaied him to China. So Howard did not get onto the Titanic. He got into a kidnapping situation, and unfortunately for him, or fortunately for him, he didn't get onto the Titanic, and he did end up surviving and escaping that little situation when he jumped off the boat in Egypt. But that's when he found out that he had lost his friend Henry and all of his music and memories with the Titanic. In the center of this case, we have wool socks and a silk tie owned by a gentleman named William Henry Allen. His family was in the wool sock making business, so I'm going to say they made a pretty good product, because it still looks pretty good in here. We had a guest here not that long ago. She had recently done her ancestry DNA tests and got some information back that she was related to someone on the Titanic. I still can't find mine, but I'm working on it. And so she comes into the museum, and here she finds her very new found relative, William Henry Allen's belongings in our case. So that, I can't imagine the feeling of that connection, of that reality, just literally hitting home like that. So over here, probably looks very familiar, this room back here. This is a reproduction of a first-class private promenade suite. It's the most expensive suite on the ship. There was two of them, one on port and one on starboard. And this room would have had a 50-foot private promenade deck right outside the door. and also a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom with that fabulous marble bathtub that the passengers would enjoy. The port side was supposed to be occupied by J.P. Morgan, who paid for the whole thing, but his doctor had advised against his sailing, so he did not get onto the Titanic, and he did pass away the following year in 1913. Instead, it was occupied by Bruce Ismay, the president of the company. And then on the other side, on the starboard side, it was occupied by Charlotte Drake Cardeza, who was the richest woman on the ship. And her family had gotten money from working in the denim industry. And she was traveling with her son Thomas. They were coming back from an African safari. They're a big hunting family. And then they both had their servants. Her maid was Anna, and then also his servant as well. All 4 of them survived, by the way. She was traveling with 27 steamer trunks, including 1 Louis Vuitton trunk for all of her shoes. And she was one of the passengers at the end that did file an insurance claim for millions of dollars, which she won. Yes, she did. She won. Now, the only way insurance claims were going to be able to be fulfilled was as long as they could prove negligence on behalf of the White Star Line. So that's where the idea that she was speeding comes from. Titanic's top speed was actually 24, 25 knots. She was only going 21 knots at the time. Compared to Lusitania and Mauritania, they could go up to 27 knots, 28 knots. Titanic wasn't trying to beat any record. She wasn't built for speed. She was built for beauty. If any record it was going to beat would have been Olympics record, but was that necessary? Maybe not. So the idea that she was speeding was because they had to prove negligence. So Titanic was insured by Lloyd's of London for her hull alone was for £1 million back then. And the rest of her pieces and parts were insured for several hundreds of thousands of pounds. And her deductible was £7,500 paid in full in 30 days. So the White Star Line was able to recoup all of that insurance money after, and so did the passengers as well. Now, Mrs. Cardeza back then paid £975 for her room. Today, that's about $96,000 for one person, for one crossing. But hey, you got all your meals included. The first class passengers had 4 dining options. They had the Café Parisien, the a la carte restaurant, which they could pay extra to eat in. And then also the first class dining saloon and the Veranda Cafe. So let's talk about some food over here. So this is the Veranda Cafe. It would have been on the boat deck at the stern section. So looking out the windows, they would have seen beautiful views of the ocean behind them. And it was decorated in a Jacobean style with the ivy growing up the walls. And in here, it would have been separated by the gentleman's side and then the ladies and the children's side. The ladies like to bring their kids into this restaurant because they like to jump around on the checkerboard floor. So when little ones come in here and start doing it, it makes me really happy because it's like, that's what they did. It's true. So they would have had light refreshments in this cafe, much like a Parisian cafe, a sidewalk cafe. Now, going back to the kids though, there was lots of children on the ship. All of the second class children survived, including 2 little boys named Edmund and Michel Navratil. And their father, Michel Sr., was actually kidnapping them from their mother, taking them to America. Didn't even know that she didn't even know that was happening. The Sunday before Titanic hit the iceberg, it was Easter Sunday. And Michel and Marcel, his wife, had separated not that long before. But she allowed her boys to be with their father for the Easter holiday. But when she went back to pick them up, she found that they were gone. He had booked passage under a fake name of Louis Hoffman, taking his boys to America. So when Titanic had hit the iceberg and everybody was going up to the boat deck to get into the lifeboats, of course, women and children first, so he was able to put the 2 little boys. Edmund was 3, and Michel Jr. was 5. And Michel Sr. said to his little ones, "Tell your mother I will always love her," and said goodbye. So he did not survive. But the boys did. And they were the only children that survived without any parent or guardian adult with them. So nobody knew who they were. And they only spoke French. So for the longest time, they were known as the Titanic orphans. It wasn't until once they got to New York, their photograph was taken and published in newspapers all over the world, and that is how their mother discovered that they had been on the Titanic, because she saw her boys in the newspaper. So she called up the White Star Line, and they brought her over to France, or over to New York to collect her children, and then took her back to France. Most of the passengers that survived couldn't really talk about what happened, but since they were little, Michel Jr., the older one, he was very outspoken up until his passing when he was about, I think, 53 years old, sometime in the 1960s that he passed. But now, after that story though, kidnapping on Titanic, if you need a drink, I have a full bottle of champagne right here. Probably took about 20 hours to recover from the ocean floor. Because of the pressure. It's 6,000 pounds of pressure down there per square inch, so we had to go really slow so that it would not explode. But based on the level of the liquid, it's probably about an 1890s vintage, most likely of Clicquot. They had thousands and thousands of bottles of champagne and wine on Titanic, because that dinner that they would have every night in the dining saloon, it was 10 courses, and each course had a wine pairing, and took about 5.5 hours to have that dinner. That was their entertainment while they were on the ship. And ladies, that would be in a corset. I don't know where you put that. But that dinner, they said also April 14th, that night, was the best dinner they had had so far. They had a consommé Olga to start. They had a fruit salad, a macédoine de fruits that had an amaretto glaze to it. They also had a fish. They had roasted squab on wilted cress. They had a beef forestier with a red wine reduction on it. They had creamed carrots that were in heavy cream with cinnamon sticks. And then they had a vegetable marrow farci, which is taking a cucumber, hollowing it out, and mixing it with breadcrumbs. I like food. Breadcrumbs and vegetables. And then they put Parmesan cheese on it and baked it. Oh my goodness. So can you imagine eating all of this every day? Oh my gosh. And then what was so fabulous too is that they had something for dessert called orange en surprise. And to have a fresh orange in the middle of the North Atlantic was just amazing to them. They also had chocolate painted eclairs, which is really good too. I say that in present tense. There's a book that exists, The Last Dinner on Titanic, that has all the recipes of all of the different classes and restaurants of that last night. No, I've tried them. Very good. They ate amazing, amazing. And I guess it was good that they had the best dinner that last night. So let's talk about my friends this way. For them, the third class, this was the first time they would ever have 3 meals. They would ever have food on the ship. Normally they'd have to bring their own. So the White Star Line wanted to get into the immigration trade and to be able to have good enough accommodations for third class that it would attract more passengers. So that's why they had 3 meals a day. They had bathrooms. They also had their own recreation room, their own dining room, and so they had wood paneling on the walls and the floors. This was very new for the third class. So they had what was probably equivalent to second class on many other ships. Second class was equivalent to first class on many other ships, and first class was just out of this world amazing. So here are some faces of some survivors and some that were not so lucky. This little boy here on the left here is Marshall Brines Drew. He was in second class. He was 8 years old, traveling with his aunt, and they both survived. Like I said, all the children in second class survived. And he grew up to become an art teacher in New York. And we had a guest here a few years ago who was standing here looking at his picture, and she was very upset. And one of my colleagues went up and asked, "Are you okay?" And she said, "This is my high school teacher." Wow. So like I said, most people couldn't talk about it. But since he was young enough and it didn't affect him in the same way that the adults would have felt it, all he could bring himself to say was that he was on the Titanic, and no one would believe him. But here he was, right there. Then this woman here in the middle, Mrs. John Stewart White, her first name was Ella, traveling in first class with her friend Marie Young. They both survived, and this woman was ahead of her time. She had an electric cane that had a light bulb on the top. And when they were out in those lifeboats, she lit the cane up and raised it up into the air so that all of the other lifeboats could see where they were, so they could all congregate together. So a woman that probably was just very socialite woman, she actually helped everybody that night. This gentleman over here, Hudson Joshua Creighton Allison, that's a lot of names, traveling in first class with his wife Bessie, daughter Helen Lorraine, who was 7, and baby Hudson Trevor, and their very new nanny named Alice Cleaver. So up in first class, easier to get to the boat deck. They are putting their life jackets on, but Alice, the maid, she gets very worked up, takes baby Trevor out of the room and goes up to the boat deck to get into a lifeboat. The parents follow a little bit after that. But Bessie and Helen Lorraine get into a lifeboat, because women and children first, but she is so distraught and worried that she doesn't know where her baby is. Her and Helen Lorraine get out of the lifeboat and they never get back into one. So Bessie was one of 4 first-class ladies that did not survive, and Helen Lorraine was the only first-class child that did not. Baby Hudson Trevor was the only survivor of that family, because of course the father didn't make it either. Not good, not good. Now, let's take a look behind us here. So here I have a beautiful cutaway of our beautiful ship. Titanic was 882.9 feet in length. Modern day cruise ships are over 1,000. Titanic, once she was completed, weighed 46,000 tons, and the largest modern day cruise ship weighs over 100,000 tons. So she was very small compared to what we know of cruise ships today, but the biggest of her time because of that little flagpole in the back. Up across was the Marconi antenna that I mentioned that's coming out of the Marconi office up there on the boat deck. And as far as sleeping quarters goes, it wasn't the third class around the bottom, then second, and then first. So up in the front, in the bow of the ship, we have the crew that is in the bumpiest part of the ship. Right behind that is third class single males. And then there was a hallway that went all the way from the front to the back on D deck called Scotland Road. That was a hallway that the crew and the third class could move about so that the first class couldn't see them. And then in the back, we had the third class single ladies that it went all the way up, right underneath my favorite deck called the poop deck. And third class single ladies and families. Then second class, which had their own smoking lounge, a library. They had 2 dining areas as well. And then in the middle of the whole middle is the first class that went all the way from basically from where the bridge was all the way to the back of the boat deck. And right in the middle of that was that private promenade suite. Of course, the center of the ship is the most stable, and that's where we have the first class dining saloon, the largest room on any floating vessel at the time. It went the whole width of the ship, meaning there was no walls inside, no structure to keep her together. So we have a problem there in the architecture. So Titanic, of course, we know was considered to be unsinkable, but that wasn't the White Star Line that started calling her unsinkable. Thomas Andrews knew way better than that was possible. It was actually the Shipbuilders Journal in 1907 that started calling her unsinkable, and it was because of 2 things. We have these thick black lines going throughout the bottom of the ship. Those were called watertight bulkheads. Created 16 compartments throughout the bottom of the ship, and watertight bulkheads were already being in use before Titanic was born. But what was new and different was something that Titanic was going to boast, which was automatic closing doors in those watertight bulkheads. Thomas Andrews had designed these doors to automatically close if they could sense water in the room, or they could automatically close by an electronic button up at the bridge. The bridge would give them a 30-second warning bell and then close the doors. So she was also designed to be able to have any 2 center compartments flooded, which her big sister Olympic proved was a correct theory. When she was out in the English Channel before Titanic was completed, she was rammed into the side by the HMS Hawke, a military ship, and 2 center compartments flooded, and she survived. No fatalities. She was towed back to Belfast to get repaired, but delayed Titanic by a few weeks. So if Titanic could have sailed sooner if Olympic hadn't gotten into an accident. Guess who was at the helm of that ship at the time? Captain Smith. So she could also stay afloat with the first 4 compartments or any 3 of the first 5. And Titanic, I said, was 882 feet in length. that iceberg scraped across about 300 feet in length into several compartments. This freak accident of a side swipe with an iceberg, not foreseeable. There was good intentions, but once she started flooding right in the mail hold, boiler room 6, it started flooding forward and back, pulling the bow section down into the water. As that stern started to come up, it did not go up 90 degrees like the movie says. It was 22 degrees, which is still terrifying. But as the stern section was rising and the bow was going down, the center section where that big dining saloon was, without any walls in there, was giving way. So she collapsed in the center, the power went out, and it broke in half below the water line. So for the longest time before she was discovered down there on the ocean floor on September 1st, 1985, people thought that she was still in one piece. Let's raise the Titanic because she's in one piece. There was a lot of testimony that happened in the 2 inquiries that happened after she sank, at the British inquiry and American inquiry, that there was no one really had seen that she was broken in half. They thought she was in one piece. And that's because it broke below the water line, even though the movie portrays it at the water line. So when it broke, it brought that stern section up. The bow started to detach, and it took 17 minutes for her to hit bottom. She's now 55 feet deep into the sediment, almost right up to her anchor. The stern section had a much more violent descent. Because it was an open cavity, now everything was falling out, which is how we have a 15 square mile debris field around the 2 pieces of the ship. There were 5 Steinway pianos on Titanic, boilers, 29 of them, I mean big heavy equipment and things, and all this stuff just falling out. At the same time, there was a rush of water that went up into the stern that caused an air bubble. And that air bubble and the rush of water forced the stern section to start turning, and she spun all the way down, so much that even when she hit bottom, she continued to spin. We can see those skid marks still on the ocean floor because as Dr. Robert Ballard, who found Titanic in 1985, says, the ocean floor only snows about 1 inch every 1,000 years, meaning only 1 inch of sediment happens over a course of 1,000 years. So obviously we're not there yet, so we can really see a whole lot going on down there. She's in 2 pieces with a half a mile in between, and the funnels are gone, the mast is gone, and she is dying. Titanic cost about $20 million back then, $17 million, around that. Titanic, the movie, cost $200 million. Could have just made the ship again. I'm glad they didn't. I don't know how I feel about Titanic 2, but I'm not going on it. All of that money, all of that engineering, all of that talent, all of that work for 4.5 days. The most beautiful part of the ship, the first class the grand staircase with that dome, with all of those first class passengers walking down under all that beauty and gold and chandeliers. Let me show you this way. Beautifulness. So our first class grand staircase is a little bit smaller than the real one was. It would have gone out much further off to the sides, and there would have been windows looking outside. It was also 5 decks worth of stairs. And Titanic was 10 decks, so the staircase really went down halfway through the ship. It was open on the sides as well, so when the first class passengers were boarding on B deck, which would have been 1 deck below where we are right now on A deck, they could have looked up through the sides of the staircase to see that beautiful dome up there on the top. The dome was made of a stained glass and a bent wrought iron frame, and the chandelier was made of Waterford crystals. During the day, they said that sun, when it passed over, it would create this beautiful flood of light that would go down the sides and into the heart of the ship and light it up. Also at nighttime, that dome was lit up with electric lights, which was also new at the time. So it simulated daylight as well. And imagine the passengers that were on A deck and so on, walking down a few flights down to that dining saloon where they would hear the White Star Line Orchestra playing, and all that music, the sound of music would come up the sides, and because of the acoustics of the dome just flood the room with that sound of the violins, they actually thought that this little cherub was a music box because they couldn't see where the music was coming from. But it is said that this cherub, she was made of bronze, and it's said that her little face was modeled after Thomas Andrews' 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth. So if that's true, in a way, she was with him when he went down with the ship. He also had the clock up at the top, specially commissioned for Titanic. It was called Honor and Glory Crowning Time. Honor's on the left, glory's on the right, and there's a crown at the base of the pedestal of the clock. It was meant to be the christening moment of the ship. They didn't break bottles of champagne on ships back then. That's a modern day tradition. So instead he had that put in as the last piece installed into Titanic, and it was supposed to protect passengers to have safe travels at sea. There was also a sister panel on the Olympic. Olympic ran for 20 years, so it worked for her. On the other side of the staircase there was 2 lifts or elevators with the lift operators. One lift the second class could also use along with the first class, and then the other lift only the first class could use because there was a couch in it. It's a really long ride in an elevator to go from one deck to another, but that was specifically for the first class. Another most amazing part of the grand staircase, very technologically advanced, very expensive, was the linoleum floor. It's just like the grocery store. They wanted to put it all over the ship. Let's put it inside and outside, but they realized it's very slippery when it's wet, so they opted not to do that. And Isidore Straus was so impressed with the grand staircase that he wanted to put the flooring and the lifts into his Macy's department store in New York. He had all the intentions of making it look like a little bit like Titanic. So my friends, you can get your pictures on the staircase at the end of the tour. Just let me know if you want to return back to this area, and I will bring you back here and you can have your picture in this beautiful piece of our story. All right, so we're going to go from the beauty of the first class down to the third. Gate look familiar? It's locked. It is, I promise. Down in the third class, like I said, there was this hallway called Scotland Road. This is what it would have looked like. Much longer, of course, but very dark, utilitarian, very plain. And of course, there were these world-famous gates throughout the third class. There was a lot of them that were locked because, like I said, the third class had to stay away from the first and second because of health regulations. But also, you can't go to the boiler room, Jack and Rose, because it's dangerous. So there was a lot of gates because they weren't supposed to go in certain parts of the ship because of that reason. There was a main stairwell, though, that was being held back by White Star Line crew to not allow the third class to get up to the boat deck. That blockade was eventually let go, and the third class did try to get out. But the problem too was that even the experienced crew on Titanic, the way that she was built, the layout, they said would have taken a good 2 weeks to get to know the way the ship was, and they only had 4.5 days. Also for the passengers, they spoke 27 languages on Titanic, and everything was written in English. So with signs like the stairs to D deck, they wouldn't have known what that meant just because they didn't speak the English. And that, so they truly were lost down here, literally. There was one third class gentleman named Patrick O'Keefe. He was from Ireland, and there was the greatest amount of Irish people on the ship. That they had the most. Ireland had the most representation on the ship. And Patrick was living at New York at that time, but he went back home to Ireland for a few months, and then his brother convinced him to stay for Easter. And Patrick really didn't want to leave home. He didn't want to go back to New York, but he had a job and he knew he had a responsibility, so he went on Titanic. He survived. He, third class, survived. And he wrote to his family that he survived, and he never heard back from them. They disowned him because he survived, which meant a she did not. So he said that he would have rather died on the Titanic than lost his family in the way he did. Another gentleman that experienced something similar was second-class passenger Masabumi Hosono. He was the only Japanese passenger on the ship, and he survived in the water, so he didn't even try to get into a lifeboat, but they picked him up out of the water. And when he went back to Japan, the government of the country shunned him because he was a descendant of samurai, and samurai serve. And if he survived, that meant a she did not. So unfortunately, though many men survived, they really got backlash for surviving at the time. Guys, what would you do? Don't answer that. So the chaos started happening below decks in the cargo hold, right this way. So if you've seen the movie, you recognize the car. Yeah, it was in a crate, for the record, not out like this. But it was a brand new 1912 French Renault being brought back to the United States, though I don't think it had a Florida license plate. But that we may never know. There's lots of things being brought back in the cargo hold. They actually had two, one in the front and one in the back. And at port, they had electric cranes that would lower all of the cargo down into this area. And so besides the car, people's suitcases, we have a set of personal dishes that, china dishes that survived and not get shattered during the sinking, amazingly enough. Also, our famous woman, Mrs. Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown. Like I said, she was not known as Molly while she was alive. She was always Margaret. She spoke 5 languages. She ran for Senate after Titanic sank. But she had to pull out of that Senate race. And women didn't have the vote yet, by the way. But she pulled out of it because World War I was starting to rumble, and her brother-in-law was a German. So out of political reasons, she backed out of that. She also became an actress, and she was very, very outspoken about Titanic, and a hero in her own right. Once she got onto the Carpathia, she raised hundreds of thousands of dollars from the first-class passengers to give to the third-class passengers to help. So she also had funded a memorial to the women and children on the Titanic that is still in New York City right now. Amazing woman. Now, she was coming back from a trip in Egypt, and she was on a tour there picking up Egyptian artifacts to take back home to the museum in Denver. And so there is several Egyptian artifacts, including a sarcophagus that is still down in the Titanic right now. At the same time this was happening, there was a gentleman in first class, William T. Stead. He was a writer, and that night at dinner, he was telling some, I hesitate to use the word ghost stories, but saying that, yes, there's a mummy on board, and it could sink the ship. So those stories got crossed, and they said it was a mummy and all that stuff. But Margaret, she got onto Titanic from Cherbourg, like I mentioned. She was visiting her daughter in France, got word that her son was sick, and that's why she booked passage onto Titanic to get home. Another Egyptian connection, there was a woman named Helen Bishop. She was one of 13 honeymooning couples on the ship, traveling with her husband, and Dickinson was his first name. And they also had been in Egypt, and she talked to an Egyptian fortune teller who said that she was going to survive a sinking, an earthquake, and a car crash, but would eventually die from the car crash. Have a nice day. So everything is happening, and she's telling her husband, we're going to survive because this woman said this, that, and whatever. And they both survived. So a few years later, they're in California, and what happens in California? That's right. They survived the earthquake. A couple years later, they're driving. She was in a car with some friends. They veer off the road. They get into a car crash. It's so bad that she had to have a metal plate put into her head because her skull was fractured. Because of that metal plate, it changed her personality, her chemistry. She became very aggressive, and Dickinson ended up divorcing her. So a few years later, she's visiting a friend. She got dizzy, slipped and fell, and died. So prophecy fulfilled. Don't talk to Egyptian fortune tellers because they're really good. Apparently. So one more thing being carried in the cargo hold I want to talk about was the mail. So Titanic, an RMS, Royal Mail Steamer, and only RMS ships could carry mail internationally. And so the guys that were in charge of the mail, their job was to take care of the mail. Anything happens, you take care of the mail. And so this is, of course, where the water first started coming in. And they're scrambling to get the mail up to the boat decks. Well, not a lot of the mail survived, but the bags did, those heavy, thick canvas bags. And when the Carpathia came to rescue the survivors, they had a swing that would come down, just like in helicopter rescue. The passengers would get on the swing, it would be lifted up. And the kids were not having an easy time of it, so they put the little ones into the bags, the mail bags, to help hoist them up to the ship. So they did not save the mail, but they saved something far more important than that. So that was those guys in the mail. Now, right next to the mail hold, what you hear is the sound of the boiler rooms. Right next to us was boiler room 6, divided by one of these watertight bulkheads with an automatic closing door. This extremely heavy iron door would go down really, really, really slow, all the way to about a foot off the ground, and then slam shut just to make sure it was watertight. So they were supposed to get a 10-second warning bell. Didn't happen. They just started closing the doors. So the guys down here started scrambling, and you definitely didn't want to be under the door when it went down. So let's go to the boiler room. So the boiler room 6, there were 6 of them. So this one was the closest, like I said, to the cargo hold. And there were 29 boilers. 24 of them were doubles with these 2 doors, and the rest were singles. And Titanic needed 850 tons of coal shoveled into her every day to keep her going. And they were shoveled in by hand. 140 men down here as stokers, firemen, trimmers, shoveling in that coal. And they worked on 12-hour shifts, and it was a very grueling task. The trimmers had to keep moving the coal from side to side so that the ship wouldn't list side to side when it would lose some of that weight of the coal. But there was one gentleman that the film we saw at the beginning talked about, Fireman Frederick Barrett. He was actually a lead stoker, putting the coals in, and he was the only one to survive down here out of the 140 men. And plus 35 engineers, none of them survived either. And he saw the water coming in, and he went up to the bridge to tell them what happened. And then he came back down because he wanted to be with his team. And as he and 2 other gentlemen, they're looking for a manhole. They wanted to unplug some electrical cords. They found the manhole. One of the guys fell into it and shattered his leg. So of course he's not getting out. Frederick had initially ordered the guys to shut the dampers, shut those doors, so that if he knew that icy water, if it hit that boiling water, it would cause an explosion. So once the water started to subside, they kept shoveling it in till the very, very end. They kept working. That work ethic that they had back then was amazing. Frederick got his way back up out of the boiler room, and as lifeboat number 13 was coming down, it was just at the same level as the deck. He walked right into lifeboat number 13 because they needed crew to help man those lifeboats too. And he gets into the lifeboat, and he looks up and he sees that number 15 is coming down really fast. At the same time, there's a blast of water from the pumps coming out of the ship that hits that lifeboat, and it starts swinging as it's going down. And those lifeboats would have been 90 feet up in the air once they were coming down off the ship. So really, really high, and it's moving, and number 15's coming down. So as soon as that lifeboat hit the water line, Frederick took his pocket knife, and he severed the ropes that were attached to the lifeboat to the davit up above, and then he took the oar out of the lifeboat and pushed it against the Titanic. It was filled with 70 women and children in this lifeboat, and was able to move that lifeboat away so that 15 wouldn't crush them. So if he hadn't had his super fast thinking, he actually saved every single person in that lifeboat. He was later questioned at the British inquiry, big, heavy, questioning by hundreds and hundreds of people that survived. And Frederick was asked, "Where would you say the water came from?" And Frederick said, I quote, "I would expect it came from the sea." Frederick Barrett. I love him. So he was definitely a hero, saved so many people. Another hero of mine is Dr. Robert Ballard, who I've mentioned a little bit before, the gentleman that found the Titanic on September 1st, 1985. And I bring it up in here for a particular reason. So he was in the Navy, and he was on sabbatical from the Navy teaching it up in an Ivy League school up north. And he comes with the idea that, why do we need to put our lives in danger to go under the water? Why can't we send an extension of our soul instead? And I like that he says soul. And so he developed the ROV, the remote operated vehicle, the robot that we use to pick up the pieces off the ocean floor. And he takes it to his colleagues, and they're like, yeah, that's a great idea. How are you going to pay for that? And he says, I'm going to take it to the Navy. So he takes it to the U.S. Navy, and they're like, that's a great idea. Okay, we'll build you your robot, but you have to do us a favor. There were 2 sunken nuclear subs back in 1958 during the Cold War called the Scorpion and the Thresher, and we need you to find them. But of course, we can't let the world know that we're looking for sunken nuclear subs. We're going to tell the world that Dr. Ballard is looking for the Titanic. So he goes off to the coast of South Carolina, which is nowhere near the North Atlantic. Yet he's scanning the ocean floor. He said he was mowing the lawn, going 5 miles and turning, and 5 miles left and right and left and right. And what he's not looking for the submarines, he's looking for the debris trail that they would have left. So he's scanning it, finds the debris trail, leads it up to the subs. Great. Okay, now will you please go find the Titanic? Because we told everybody you would. So him and his team, they go up to the North Atlantic. And he said that if he hadn't found the subs in the way that he had, there's no way that he would have found the Titanic. So if everything happens for a reason. So they're scanning and they're scanning. This debris field, like I said, it's 15 square miles. It's huge. And he knew, since it only snows once every 1,000 years, he knew he was not going to have any problem finding it, or seeing it at least. So it was the morning of September 1st, 1985. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Remember, Titanic sank at 2:20 in the morning. Keep that in mind. So he's up on the ship. They've got a submersible, the little boat, the ships that they take down underneath. Not as big as submarines, smaller than that. But he's up there, and he's like, he just could not sleep that night. He just had a feeling. And all of a sudden, he gets a knock at the door from the cook on the ship saying, "Boss, you got to come and see this." So he goes up to the control room, and he's looking on the monitors, and the first thing that was seen of Titanic for over 70 some years was a face of a boiler. This face, which looks like eyes, a mouth, looking up at them from the ocean floor. And they thought, yes, we found the Titanic. It's the ultimate in shipwrecks, the Everest of discoveries. And then they realized, we found the Titanic. It was about close to the time in the morning that it happened. So they had a prayer service on the deck to remember what happened here. And it became very solemn and somber after that. And Dr. Ballard could have put claim on Titanic. He found it. It could have been his, but he chose not to. It's bigger than him. So this story was finally, for him, declassified in 2017, and I was lucky enough to be in the room with him in LA when he got to tell that story. And to hear him in the same room, the energy coming off of it, I've got goosebumps thinking about it. Just this man who found the Titanic, unbelievable. So he goes down to the depths of the ocean, and funny enough, his brother's an astronaut. So lots of stuff going on down there, and then also going on down in the boiler room. Now we're going to go up to the bridge where the captain was. All right, so this is the bridge, or the wheelhouse, where the wheel was, and the Captain Edward John Smith, his quarters would have been on the other side of this wall. And he had gone to bed about 9:40 that night. He put Officer Lightoller in charge, and then his shift was over, and he put Officer William McMaster Murdoch in charge. He was fully qualified to steer this ship. He had years behind him in experience. There's 2 other guys that had a lot of experience that were outside, up in the crow's nest, about 50 feet up in the air, Reginald Lee and Frederick Fleet. And amazingly enough, both of them survived. So the conditions that night were very clear, very calm, very crisp, beautiful, and very dangerous at the same time. The passengers thought, this is amazing. There's so much starlight out there. There was no moon, but only starlight. And that's really all that they could see. Not a whole lot. Where they were in the North Atlantic is about 300 or so miles south of Newfoundland in what's called the Labrador Corridor. And it's some of the fastest moving water north to south in the world. And it's also where the warm Gulf air of where we are right now comes up the northeast and clashes with the cold Arctic air that's coming down. And because of that clash of air masses, it causes a bit of a mirage, just like when you're out in the desert and you see water on the ground and it disappears. It's like the same phenomenon that was happening. So they couldn't see the horizon line. They couldn't see where the stars stopped and the water began because of this mirage that was happening. Also, they had, like I said, a very warm winter that just a few months before, and because of that the icebergs were further south, but also those icebergs, they would melt and refreeze and melt and refreeze, and the more often that happens, the lower the center of gravity and the more pressure that those icebergs have inside of them. And literally that iceberg, it wasn't bright and white and fluffy and polar bears dance around it, it was literally a black berg, black ice. So they couldn't see. There was so much pressure in that iceberg, light couldn't reflect off. And Frederick knew that what he wasn't going to see was icebergs, he was going to see a lack of stars. So as he's looking out at that horizon line, using just his eyes. Now, they didn't have binoculars, true. They didn't have access to the binoculars, true. But even if they had, binoculars were only used at port when you were leaving and coming in. So they wouldn't have used the binoculars out at open sea anyway. But finally, what he saw, he said, was something as small as his pinky fingernail. And it was growing and growing and growing very rapidly. He realized this is an iceberg. He rang the bell 3 times. He called the bridge, said iceberg right ahead, got a very polite thank you, and hang up on the phone. And they had 37 seconds before she hit. Officer Murdoch gave the order to Quartermaster Hitchens here at the wheel to go hard to starboard. He meant to port around it, like turn the wheel to the right because the ship is going to go to the left to get around the iceberg. But he also gave a second call of stop full astern. And that was meant to, you can't stop a ship in moving water, but it meant it slowed it down. And he knew, though, that the faster a ship went, the faster it could turn. But unfortunately, in the moment, in the stress of the moment, anxiety, and I can't even imagine what that was like, he gave that second call. And the only artifact that we have in this room is this telegraph here. There would have been one on the bridge and then one in the engine room. This one's from the engine room. And that's how they would communicate with each other. On both sides, there was a panel that would say ahead and astern, and then stop, full stop, dead stop, and reverse, and so on. And when we found this piece in 1996, it was all by itself in the debris field, and the handle on this side that they would have used to move back and forth, that then the twin telegraph would have moved with it. This handle is still in the position of Officer Murdoch's last call. So of all the pieces that we've seen so far, of pieces of the ship, pots and pans and postcards and flooring and things like that, all important. Don't get me wrong, all important. But this is the very first piece that you're seeing that has everything to do with Titanic sinking. Still in fairly good condition. The belts are gone, the panel's gone, but it's still standing, trying to give that last order. And what's left of the bridge itself, the walls, the windows, the ceiling, it's all gone. All that's left is the structure of the wheel, standing there all by itself. Captain Smith woke up. He said, "What happened?" Officer Murdoch said, "We hit an iceberg." He says, "Did you open up the pumps, the water, push the water out?" "Yep." "Close the watertight doors?" "Yes." It took them 47 minutes, though, to start loading lifeboats. Lost time. Captain Smith didn't know what to do. Before he set sail on Titanic, he was asked, "How would you say your career has been?" And he said, "Uneventful." And yet he was there for the collision with the Olympic. So he had his own bumps and bruises. But he also said that he couldn't imagine the way that shipping had been and shipbuilding, the technology that had been rapidly growing faster and faster into the future. He said, "I can't imagine anything being that big and dangerous that could sink a ship." Captain Smith did not survive. He went down with his ship. But he tried to get some of them off, out on the boat deck, right this way. So this is the promenade deck. Would be one deck below where the boat deck, where the launch boats were being launched from, or lifeboats being launched from. And of course, there was not enough lifeboats. There were 20 lifeboats, 16 real ones, and then 4 collapsibles made out of wood and wrought iron and canvas. And initially, the first designer, Alexander Carlisle, he wanted 64 lifeboats, which would be more than enough for the capacity that Titanic could have, which was over 3,000 people. Thankfully, she only had 2,206 on board, but still not enough. Once Thomas Andrews assumed the role of managing director and designer, he then brought it down to 32 lifeboats. Still enough, but then by a general consensus, not just one person to blame, it was brought down to the legal limit of 16, but we'll give them a bonus 4 on top of that.
Are there any more women before this boat goes?
I'm only a steward.
Get away. You're a woman. Take your place.
So the law had been written back in 1892, 20 years before Titanic set sail, that lifeboat amounts weren't based on capacity, it was based on gross tonnage of a ship. And back then they could only imagine a ship being 10,000 tons, and Titanic was 46,000 tons. So they also thought that there's enough ships out there going back and forth that there would be somebody close enough to somebody and the ship would be its own lifeboat. Obviously that was incorrect thinking. Lifeboat laws changed because of Titanic. So, like I said, 47 minutes after she hit, that's when they started launching lifeboats. 1, because they weren't sure what was going to happen, but 2, because there was a lot of hesitation by the women to want to get into those tiny little boats out there on the dark, cold water, because they want to stay here on this nice, big, warm ship. And if their husbands weren't allowed to go with them, they didn't want to leave them behind. So there was a stewardess down in first class named Violet Jessup. And she was a stewardess on the Olympic at the time of the collision with the HMS Hawk. And she survived that situation. And her friends said, hey, let's go to Titanic because that should be interesting. And so they did. They transferred to Titanic. And as Titanic was sinking, Violet ran into Thomas Andrews. And Thomas Andrews says, Violet, go be a good example and show the women how to get into the lifeboats and that it's okay. So she goes up to the deck and she's helping. She's helping whatever she can do, and all of a sudden someone puts a baby in her arms. No idea who this baby is. She's just hanging on to it. She gets into the lifeboat, still hanging on to the baby. She gets up to the Carpathia, still hanging on to the baby. And all of a sudden some woman takes the baby out of her arms. Doesn't say a word. So Violet, after Titanic, she went to work a few years later on the Britannic, Titanic's little sister. And the Britannic, at the time when she was finished being built, she went right into His Majesty's Hospital ship service for World War I. And on November 21st, 1916, she was sailing in the Aegean Sea in the Greek islands, and she was torpedoed and sank. And Violet was there. So she survived all 3 Olympic class ships. And she didn't know how to swim. And she continued to work on ships for the next 40 years. And at one point, she got a phone call when she was at home in England, and on the voice on the other side of the line said, I was the baby you saved on the Titanic. So she was giving her autobiography to a writer who recorded it in 1970, and he asked her, how do you know that wasn't a prank? And she said, because I never told anybody about that baby before. So not only did she survive these 3 sinking ships, although the one didn't sink, she also survived tuberculosis when she was a baby. They didn't think she was going to make it. But she had a job to do. And when she was asked, do you feel lucky that you survived all of these disasters? She said, no. No, it was just a certain thing you have to do. Maybe you don't think it's your affair, but maybe it is. And it's God's wish that you're there at that moment to do your duty. Violet Jessup passed away in 1971, and her autobiography, Titanic Survivor, was published after. You can hear her beautiful, comical voice on a recording of that interview on YouTube. And I highly recommend Violet Jessup. So there was not a lot of happy endings, of course. The Strausses, Isidore and Ida Strauss, they were traveling back to New York from visiting family in Germany, and they were traveling with their servants, and Ida's maid named Ellen, and Thomas was Isidore's servant. And they got to the lifeboats, and Ellen gets into the lifeboat, and then Ida gets into the lifeboat, and she turns around to see that Isidore isn't following her. And he said, I can't. I can't. It's women and children first. So Ida gets out of the lifeboat to be with her husband. And she takes her fur coat off, gives it to Ellen in the lifeboat, and said, I won't be needing this anymore. So the last thing that Ellen saw of her employers, they were standing on the deck, holding hands, and a wave washed them away. And once those ships were going back and forth across the North Atlantic, as usual, somebody said that they saw a woman holding onto a dog in the water.
Be brave! No matter what happens, be brave!
Someone also said that they saw a woman holding onto a baby out there in the water. Because where they were, like I said, was very fast moving water. Those bodies could travel 40 miles a day. And those that were lucky enough to get into those very few lifeboats, they kept pulling further and further away. Some that could turn around and look said they could see 5 rows of lights, 4 rows of lights, 3 rows of lights, and eventually nothing. They saw that stern section rising up out of the water, and they said all of a sudden they could see the swarm of people all over the back end of the ship. And that was the 3rd class that finally got out, only to find that there was no hope, nowhere for them to go. Staring death in the face. Second class man that survived said that he would go to baseball games, and instead of hearing the cheers of the home run, instead he'd hear the screams of Titanic. So even though they got off the ship, they never really left. Only 706 people survived. 1,496 people lost their lives. Was it because the idea they were speeding? No. Was it because of the bad luck? No. Because they hit an iceberg. Why does it take a tragedy to do what's right? Lifeboat laws, ice patrols, lifeboat drills, all because of Titanic. The radio has to be on. And like I said, the closest ship that was coming was the Carpathia, and it would take them 4 hours to get here. So those people out in those lifeboats, just out in the darkness, in the cold, freezing air. It's 28 degrees in that water. Hypothermia sets in about 10 to 20 minutes. Margaret Brown said, we have to go back. Only one boat went back. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe was in charge of that lifeboat. They pulled 12 bodies out of the water. The last thing they heard before the the thunder of the ship breaking apart was the White Star Line Orchestra playing Near My God to Thee. That orchestra had 8 men in it, led by Wallace Hartley. And one of my favorites, Jock Hume, he was 21 years old from Dumfries, Scotland, and he had just said goodbye to his fiancée Mary, who was pregnant and he didn't know it. And she had no legal right to find out what happened to him because they weren't married yet. But it wasn't for about 36 days that his father found out he had lost his son on Titanic because he received the bill for his uniform. But Jock's grandson now owns the violin that was made for his grandpa. The week after, there was a ship that came out called the Mackie Bennett.
Are there any more women before this?
And it came out to recover bodies out of the water. And they said that they found all 8 musicians together in the water. The last song they had sang at the last church service earlier that day was called Eternal Father. And the last line of that song is for those in peril on the sea.
Be brave! No matter what happens, be brave!
Like I said, 1,496 people lost their lives that night. So we'll just take another moment to remember them.
Darling, don't worry. We're going in the next boat.
They were real people just like we are. Titanic was the largest loss of life in a single event until 9/11. May those brave souls, those beautiful souls, rest in peace.
It's all right, little girl. You go and I'll stay a while.
So in the next room on your boarding pass, you'll be able to see whether your passenger, that soul that was there the night of April 14, 1912, survived or did not. Very stable, but it worked. They still got water inside, feet were in the water. And not a lot of people in this boat. At first, they were launching the first 2 half full because they weren't sure, and the ladies just didn't want to get into them. But as the Carpathia came across the horizon, hours later, they didn't know what they were going to find. They found hundreds of bodies scattered in the water, and those 20 lifeboats just floating, filled with terrified survivors that probably couldn't even process what they just went through. And the captain of the Carpathia, Captain Henry Rostron, like it says up there, he said, some other hand than mine was on the helm, because he was fighting those same ice fields that Titanic went through as well. And he had 740 passengers and 325 crew members on his ship, and they went. They were prepared with blankets, soup, coffee, anything and everything they could think of to help those passengers that they were going to find. He was hailed a hero in Titanic's story. The ship that was closer to them, the Californian, had turned off the radio like I mentioned. They didn't hear the calls. And Captain Stanley Lord of that ship, his career ended after Titanic. Why didn't you go? Why didn't you go? He didn't know. Because of that very strange fog for a horizon line, because he couldn't see that was the Titanic. It was creating this illusion that it was something smaller. He couldn't see what was going on. There was also another ship that they said, this phantom ship that they had seen out on the horizon. Passengers said they saw a light of a ship that just disappeared. It's thought that it was actually a German ship that ran on a different radio signal, and they didn't know either. So it took several hours for people to really know what happened. All those radio signals going out around the North Atlantic seaboard, radio operators getting garbled messages of Titanic is being towed, all were saved, Titanic is okay, and so on. But there was a lot of misinformation because of it. So families didn't know for sure whether their loved ones survived or did not. Visiting the White Star Line offices in New York and in Liverpool and in Ireland, just begging for information, which the White Star Line wasn't giving out because nothing was confirmed yet. But if you come down here, there's several newspapers from the days and weeks that followed of the information that was, some of them got it right, a lot of them got it wrong. There's this one paper from April 20th, the Evening Star in Washington, D.C., and as you pass by, you'll see the two little Navratil boys, the orphans that survived. A picture of all the musicians. Wallace Hartley, Jock Hume, and the rest of the gentlemen that were lost. And May 24th, just a month later, there was a huge concert held at Royal Albert Hall in London in honor of the musicians. There was 472 musicians in that orchestra to a crowd of an audience of over 100,000 people. They raised money to give to the families of the musicians and the survivors that were coming to the United States in third class to change their lives and had nothing with them. There's also a memorial for the musicians in Southampton. It's right across from a memorial for the engineers. And unfortunately, during World War II, it was bombed and destroyed. So they had to rebuild it, and in it is some of the music from Nearer My God to Thee. Over here on this side of me is the only known photograph of the Marconi office from Titanic, and that is our good friend Jack Phillips working hard. Last year, there was talk that our company was going to retrieve the Marconi radio out of the ship. Last year was last year. So hopefully we'll be able to save it and hear it. Hear her voice again. There's one more man I want to talk about. Little picture right there. That's Mr. Ismay, president of the White Star Line. And Bruce has really become the villain of this piece. History has made him the one to blame. And I refuse to do so. There is that story, that alleged story, that some woman heard him and Captain Smith talking about, let's make it go faster. There's no proof that happened. Again, Titanic wasn't built to speed, she was built to be beautiful. And the Ismay family was a very, very giving family, and they would donate church steeples to churches in the town, and very charitable family. And he knew that there would be families on the dock in New York at the time when Titanic would arrive. If they got in any sooner, where would we put these people? They would stay on the ship. What's the point? So Bruce, as soon as he got onto the Carpathia, he was taken into the ship's hospital and secluded there. I can't imagine how he would feel, or how he felt. He spent the next 20 years also in seclusion, living at a home called Costello Manor in Ireland. Ironically enough, in the country that lost the most amount of people. That's where he sought refuge to live out his days. And he passed in 1937. I asked his cousin Cliff, who I talk to often in England, and I asked him, how did he keep breathing? How did he keep going after this monstrosity of a disaster? And he said he just lived a day at a time. He fished, he did what he could until he just couldn't anymore. So I will never judge Mr. Ismay, because what history doesn't tell us is that he was helping launch lifeboats. And if you were right there at that moment and there's nobody else there to get into that boat, what do? Do you get in? Probably. Now here is a very large piece of ice, not as large as the iceberg. That iceberg would have been hundreds of feet up into the air, and like the saying goes, it's just the tip of the iceberg. 80% of an iceberg is below the water line, and Titanic scraped against the iceberg 20 feet below. So without radar and sonar like we have today, there's no way they would have known that that big chunk of ice was sticking out. And they scraped along the bottom, and water started coming in, and all of the conspiracy theories and thoughts of what really sank the Titanic, that's it. Just an iceberg. Nothing else. I mentioned the Mackie Bennett, the recovery process that happened at the a week after she sank. And it came out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. And it was a ship filled with 80 fishermen from the town and as much embalming fluid as they could find and hundreds of wooden caskets. And they went out to the wreck site. They pulled out about 300 bodies out of the water to bring them back to Halifax and bury them in Fairview Cemetery. One of the first bodies that they found was one of a 2-year-old little boy. No way to identify him. But the registrar of the city of Halifax told the crew that the way that they were going to identify bodies was look for a name in a pocket, anything, write it down. Every body gets a number. Write down male, female, hair color, weight, height, clothing, and so on and so forth. Take everything out of their pockets and put it into a bag that has the same number as the body. And that same forensic identification process that John Henry Barnstead created for Titanic is what our modern day forensic identification process is based off of as well. So when they brought the bodies back to Halifax, they were all stored in the curling rink of the city. It was the largest, coldest facility they had, and they took photographs to be able to send it out to the survivor or the families, and so that they could be identified. A gentleman by the name of Vincent Astor, John Jacob Astor's son, who was 19 years old, he had sent a message to the Mackie Bennett saying, if anybody finds my father's body, I will pay them $10,000, which was an enormous amount of money at that time. And the crew found him. He was a little dirty, hence the idea that he was crushed by a funnel, but his body was in perfectly fine condition, so that story doesn't work. But his name was embroidered into his collar, and he had $2,500 of cash on him. So they knew that was John Jacob Astor. And Vincent then sent the money to the crew, and they used that money to help bury that 2-year-old boy. And finally in 2007, through DNA testing, we're able to know that that 2-year-old little boy was Sidney Goodwin. He was one of 8 in his family, traveling in 3rd class, and they all were lost. But he has a name on his headstone now. The richest man on the ship helped the poorest little one possible. The youngest person on the Titanic was Milvina Dean, and she was only 7 weeks old on the ship. And her mother and brother survived. And Milvina was the very last survivor to pass away. She passed in 2009. She was living in assisted living in England, and for the last few years of her life, she was running out of money to pay for it. And James Cameron and Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio found out and paid for her living expenses for the last few years. So that big Hollywood movie helped the last survivor on Titanic. It's beautiful. So there's one more piece that I want to show you. It is a almost 2-ton piece of my heart. It is a piece of Titanic. So this is a piece of the hull. The starboard side, same side as the iceberg, towards the back 2 funnels in between. Piece of D deck, so just a few decks below from the top. It was attached to a much larger piece, almost 15 tons above. Imagine an upside down L. And that piece was cabin C79 and 81. It was not occupied. And that piece now lives at the Luxor in Las Vegas. It's so big they had to take the top of the pyramid off to lower it down. So we have lovingly called the piece the big piece. It was raised in 1998, but the process started in 1996. So that was the first time they went out, RMS Titanic Inc., several ships as well, bringing passengers just to see Titanic, see the light for the first time in decades. And unfortunately, it didn't work out so well. They took submersibles down, they took ROVs down, one of which called the T-Rex that had a camera built inside. It was created by a physicist named Dr. Bill Willard, and he was part of that team of brilliant minds to help raise her out of the ocean. And they attached 7 Kevlar balloons filled with diesel fuel, because the diesel doesn't compress at that depth, and it would act as like helium to air and bring it up out of the ocean. And they brought it up just a few hundred feet below the surface. Some scuba divers went down to see it, to check it, and they realized that the crane that was attached to the A-frame that it was attached to bring it up stopped working. They also found that the A-frame wasn't wide enough to bring the piece through. So they had a decision to make. Do they cut and let her go and come back, or they went for door number 2 and tried to tow it with the intentions of bringing it back to Halifax. It's always Halifax because it's the largest city port closest to where the wreck site was. And unfortunately then a hurricane was coming. So they attached sensors to the piece and let her go back to the ocean floor. So this time, instead of laying on its side in the debris field, it was stuck straight up and down into the sediment. And it took 2 years later, 1998, in the early August, they went back, and between RMS Titanic Inc., the Discovery Channel, and NBC, who documented it, they were able to successfully bring her to the light. She's been very heavily preserved because she's out in the oxygen. But it's a beautiful way to see her craftsmanship and how she was built by hand. These iron plates overlapping about an inch or so thick, 3 million rivets put together. It took 4 men to put 1 rivet in at a time. And on the inside of the plates, how they're overlapping, there was an oil-soaked rope to help prevent seepage. You could see where the cutouts of windows were at one point. Also, the big piece still has glass in the windows. This would have been a 90-degree angle in interior wall, but you can see how it's bent from its descent. And it was part of the stern section, the section that had been spinning as it went down to the bottom. So it had blown off in that descent the first time. So there's 2 schools of thought. Do we leave her there? She's a grave site, yes. But they're not there anymore. Do we recover her so that we can talk about her and learn from her and keep their memories alive? Because for what else then? Why were they there? What else? What purpose did they serve? Like we said, laws changed and lives changed because of Titanic, but the individuals that were there, to see her, to stand in her presence, those that were there. It's important to remember history so it doesn't happen again. As she's sitting down in the bottom of the ocean, she's dying. There's hundreds of rusticles that are covering her, sections of rusty bacteria that are creating these what looks like icicles, and her stern section is almost unrecognizable. Her bow section is falling forward on itself, and she was forged from iron ore from the earth, and now these bacteria that are eating at her are redepositing her back into the earth. So in a way, she's being recycled back into the world. They give her 10 to 50 years, which is a pretty long span. But it's probably the biggest piece we'll ever be able to recover. And when you look at a historical photograph of the starboard side, her right side, if you're looking forward, just behind those back two funnels, that's what you're looking at. That's Titanic. So I want to thank you all very, very much for being here and caring about her, to come and see her and remember her and talk about her. And thank you for spending time with me listening about her, my favorite thing in the whole wide world, if you can't tell that by now. And if you have any questions, please let me know. My name is Lorelei. I'll be out in the front. If you want to visit the grand staircase to get your picture on the staircase, it's going to be right through this door. But thank you so much for being here and supporting Titanic. So thank you.
Thank you.